What was the impact of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal on American society? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as you all know, brings you the principal case for the libertarian philosophy, and I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who I think is on spring break. Am I correct, Richard?
I'm on spring break this week, trying to catch up with other things I need to do, including doing this program, which I enjoy immensely with you every week.
Well, me too, and I hope you all enjoy it too. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principled articles and speeches and conferences and presentations on the libertarian philosophy. Subscribe to our FFF Daily. So, Richard, I thought we would discuss Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. I mean, this was obviously a pivotal point in American history. I think it really reflected the conversion of our economic system to a welfare state, which I consider is a variation of socialism. It was a watershed event for America. I mean, we had started out with a system that was totally different from the system that Roosevelt foisted upon the American people and with which we're still living today. Now, we know that there were some bad founding principles of this country, slavery being the most notable. But there were also some good founding principles. And those were, for example, no income tax, no IRS. People were free to keep everything they earned, decide for themselves what to do with it. No mandatory charity or socialist programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, statism. No national security state, no Pentagon, CIA, and NSA. It was a limited government republic with just a basic military force. No state-sponsored assassinations, no foreign wars, no foreign interventionism, foreign aid, no immigration controls. It was actually a unbelievably unusual system, and the results of this system were, I think, best manifested in the period from around 1890 to 1910, where you had this tremendous outburst of economic prosperity. I mean, people were going from rags to riches from in one generation, two generations, three generations. This despite the fact that many of these people were penniless immigrants. Many of them couldn't even speak English. I mean, people were coming to this new land to get rich and make money and survive and prosper. Also, the greatest outburst of voluntary charity. When people were free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, they gave it away. That's how the churches got built, the museums, the opera houses, the libraries. Remarkable period. And Americans really, Richard, in my opinion, discovered the key to ending poverty. And they
They
discovered,
did.
yeah, I mean, you had this massive accumulation of savings when people had all this income. The savings would go into banks. The banks would lend it out to their employers to buy tools and equipment, which would make the workers more productive, which would increase revenues for the firm, which would raise wage rates. No Federal Reserve. I mean, you had sound money, gold and silver coins, no paper money. It's a remarkable system, but Roosevelt's New Deal transformed it all. Now, it had started, though. I mean, you and I both know that the socialist ideas were percolating in the late 1800s during this remarkable period. There were people going abroad in Germany to study, and they were bringing back these newfangled ideas like Social Security and government-provided health care. And then in 1913, you had these two big events, the 16th Amendment, which authorized the federal government to have a national income tax. And it was always promised that it would be only on the rich, only on the rich. And then the establishment of the Federal Reserve, which set the basis for what happens in the 1920s. And this is where the Austrians come into play, as well as Milton Friedman, that we were often taught in our public schools that the stock market crash in 1929, which leads to the Great Depression, was the failure of America's free enterprise system. It's been a lie from the very beginning, as Friedman and the Austrians showed. It was the problem with the Federal Reserve. They had inflated paper money, the instruments of indebtedness that the federal government had. And then when people started realizing, hey, there's not enough paper in there to satisfy the gold demands, and there was going to be runs on the banks, the Fed panics and over contracts the issuance of debt instruments. And the result is the stock market crash that then leads to the Great Depression. And then we get Roosevelt's New Deal. So let me just stop there and pass the baton over to you.
Well, the thing is, the 30s were a watershed with the New Deal. But as you were suggesting, we need to also remember the historical context that these ideas did not appear in a vacuum. They had started at the beginning of the 20th century um, with the progressive era. Many of these academics or intellectuals who, as you were saying, studied in Europe, particularly at German universities, in Imperial Germany, where Bismarck had started introducing the modern welfare state programs. They came back and imbued with these ideas, they became sort of a front line for trying to get them introduced into America. And then, of course, the first opportunity to try to do this occurs with Woodrow Wilson's administration. He came to the presidency in 1912, had 2 terms, which included the First World War. But then, even under the Republicans in the 1920s, one has to realize that they were no longer uh, uh, at least on domestic issues, advocates of laissez-faire. Republicans back in the 19th century were always the pro-protectionist people. Um, but it's worth keeping in mind that while Calvin Coolidge, the president in the mid 1920s, was sound on a lot of things. He was for low taxes, light regulation, balancing the budget surpluses to pay off the debt. He had a Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, who was basically a social engineer. He was proposing government business partnerships, rationalizing industry to make it more productive. And so there was this mix in the 1920s in the thinking of where America should go. And then the new direction really happened with Herbert Hoover. Um, he ran in 1928 as the successor to Calvin Coolidge. He took office in early 1929. Very popular. He was considered a national hero. He was a well-known engineer. He had led the food relief programs in Europe for the starving millions in the wake of the First World War, including food relief in a Russia that was battling in a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the anti-communist armies. Um, and so he came to the White House in early 1929 as considering the epitome of the type of person Americans would want as their symbolic leader of the country. Yet, of course, just a few months later in October comes the crash, and his stigma for the remainder of his presidential term is that he allowed the Great Depression to occur. He allowed the Great Depression to occur. But the fact is, he was far from a laissez-faire president. Anyone who's interested in this would do well to read Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression, which covers the Hoover administration and the degree to which Hoover was running budget deficits, raised taxes on the wealthy, imposed the most severe protectionist trade laws in American history, undertook the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was basically a way of government subsidizing and propping up businesses that really needed to properly rebalance and adjust to the post-boom period. So therefore, kept the economy out of whack and made the Depression worse. He tried to jawbone businesses not to lower prices or for wages to be adjusted. And so the Depression just snowballed. And so now 1932 comes along, and he's coming up for re-election, and he decides to run. But it was clear, obviously probably not to him, but it was clear now, certainly in retrospect, that there was no way he was going to get re-elected. To just give you some indications of the social climate, Jacob, people would say that the Depression is hoovering over us. People would say, I live in a Hooverville. That's living in a cardboard box under a train trestle. I live in Hooverville. Or you've lost your job. You don't have $2.25 to pay for a flop house bed. So you're sleeping outdoor in the park. But it's winter. What do you cover yourself with? I use a Hoover blanket. That's covering yourself with newspapers on the park bench. This guy was not going to get reelected. But what kind of, now, Franklin Roosevelt, who the Democrats nominated as their candidate for the 32 election, he had been governor of New York. He was a cousin of a former president, Theodore Roosevelt. He had served as Undersecretary of the Navy in Woodrow Wilson's administration during the First World War, had been an enthusiastic supporter of Wilson's both foreign and domestic policies. But the irony of it is, Jacob, is that if you read the 1932 Democratic Party platform, that is, what is Franklin Roosevelt running on? What is he promising to the American people that would be better than this depression that is symbolized by Herbert Hoover? Balance the budget, cut taxes, reduce the deficit, maintain a solid, sound currency on gold, maintain a modest but non-prohibitive tariff system, and recognize states' rights. The federal government should not excessively meddle in state affairs. So this is the party platform that Franklin Roosevelt is offering to the American people in 1932. Let me suggest that based upon the words in the platform, any classic liberal, any libertarian of alive and a voter in 1932 would say, this is a candidate who stands for the sound, basic founding principles of the United States. This is going to put America on the right, solid track of the founding fathers. So, of course, it had nothing to do with the platform that resulted into Roosevelt's election. It basically was anyone who wasn't Hoover was clearly going to be elected president. And so he takes office in March of 1933. Back then, presidents were inaugurated not in January as today, but in March. And within days after taking over the presidency, and based upon the imagery presented by him in his inaugural address, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And we can pull ourselves out of this, but Americans have to be brought together under national leadership. And he will ask for these things from Congress, and he will expect the support of the American people. But if necessary, if it is necessary to implement emergency measures with executive authority, he must bring America out of the Great Depression. And so the Democrats won strongly in the congressional elections of 32 as well. Roosevelt has majorities in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and he proceeds to implement all of that became known as the alphabet soup series of programs: NRA, the National Recovery Administration; AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration; WPA, Works Progress Administration; CC, Civilian Conservation Corps, on and on and on and on. And all of this now, what he implements, inspired by advisors, his brains trust, as it was called, was basically a form of planned economy modeled after Mussolini's fascist system in Italy. Businesses were mandated to be members of government overseen cartels, in which the cartel authorities, basically businesses with America as the senior partner, would determine prices, wages, production levels, quantities to be produced. And the same thing in agriculture with Agricultural Adjustment Act. The government now told farmers nationwide what crops to grow and in what quantities. If they produced the wrong crops or too many, it was to be plowed under. What livestock to raise: cattle, horses, chicken, geese, et cetera, et cetera. And if too many were produced, they had to be slaughtered. This was a way of minimizing excess production and propping up prices. And then at the same time, supporting unions. The first really active presidential effort to bolster, give legalized authority to unions to have strikes, uh, keep, quote, scabs out, that is, non-union members replacing union workers who choose to leave their job. Resist any wage cuts to bring labor markets into balance with the lower demands of the Depression years for goods and services. Uh, Huge public works projects, the Civilian Conservation Corps, bringing unemployed young people to basically in sort of like a boot camp style to go out to the national parks to clean up the national parks, marching around with a shovel instead of a rifle. The entire U.S. economy was regimented, Jacob. This is a transformation that is difficult to even conceive based upon what America was like before that. There were propaganda rallies. At halftime in football games, there'd be the blimp over the arena and the old-fashioned newsreel cameras. They would take pictures of the field during halftimes, and people would go out and form shapes of the Blue Eagle, which was the symbol of the National Recovery Administration, the cartelization of industry. They would have parades to arouse support for this. In one of these old newsreels that you can see on YouTube, the famous singer of the 1920s, Al Jolson, who sang Mammy and Swanee, a reporter sticks a microphone in his mouth, Jacob, and says, Al, what do you think of NRA? And he says, NRA? NRA? It's better than my wedding night. And for the younger people who are watching, that's when wedding nights used to mean something. In other words, you didn't do it until you got married. And NRA was bigger than his wedding night. So, uh, but this was the entire atmosphere. It was a regimentation of the economy, a militarist attempt to, we're going to fight the depression as if it's something exogenous, something coming from the outside, like a virus that nature suddenly hits you with that is beyond your control. The idea that the Hoover policies, now exacerbated by Roosevelt's policies, were preventing the necessary adjustments, corrections, and rebalances to enable labor markets to return to full employment, output to a balanced market-based production in various amounts and in directions, that prices and wages should find their market levels. This was not even considered at this time. And yet these were the things that kept the Depression going. And in this context, if I can just add another thing, you know, it has been decades now that the young person who goes to school and has a history book, if they teach history anymore, oh, Franklin Roosevelt saved America. He ended the Great Depression. If not for him, the fact is he did not cure the Depression. The Depression went on all the way through the 1930s. As late as 1938, unemployment in the United States was still in the range of between 15 and 16%. Now, it is not as bad as it was at the depth of the Depression in late 1932 and early 33, when, as measured by the government, unemployment of the labor force was about 25%. But that's basically because the government created all these artificial jobs through deficit spending. And just naturally, certain parts of the economy just finally recovered modestly itself. But the fact is, to have 15% unemployment after being in office for now from 1933 to 1938 is not a cure of the depression. 15% unemployment is considered depression unemployment by virtually any economist, regardless of what, school of thought label that they walk around with. Now, people say, but Roosevelt finally cured all this through the war. Well, what does that mean? If you draft 10 million men, if you put every housewife in an armaments factory as Rosie the Riveter, and if you control and the government now takes over the economy completely in the name of the war effort, and basically commands and controls what gets produced and how it's produced, regardless of whether that is what people would want as consumer-based demanders, then yeah, the war ended the economy, the depression, but purely by taking over the economy and forcing people into this. The contrast that would sometimes be made in the early 1930s was, see, capitalism has failed. Look at the unemployment, idle production while there's poverty all around. Look at the Soviet Union. Look at Soviet Russia. Under Stalin, there's no unemployment. Yeah, there was no unemployment. It was called the Gulag. It was a prison system where there would be quotas, Jacob, government central planning quotas for how many people were to be arrested and executed and how many people were to be arrested and sent to do forced labor in the forced modernization and industrialization of Russia. Sure, if everybody is rounded up and sent to work in a labor camp in Siberia to build an artificial city in the middle of nowhere, yeah, you have no unemployment. But Roosevelt hadn't been able even to do that. So the fact is that Roosevelt did not save America. He did not end the Depression. He did not bring prosperity back to the country. Instead, what his policies did was to overturn the entire history of the United States institutionally, the relationship of the federal government to the state governments, the relationship of the federal government to the private economic affairs of the citizenry, the relationship of government to the personal freedoms of the American citizen. Now, I might just mention that uh, some of the viewers and listeners may know, because I've referred to her before, my wife, Anna. She originally comes from the Soviet Union. We met in Moscow. And she did her PhD dissertation at Moscow State University on the impact of the impact of mass media on American presidential elections from Franklin Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan. And doing this kind of research, she had access to all the forbidden parts of the libraries, the things that the ordinary citizen couldn't read, like the truth, including stuff about the United States and Franklin Roosevelt. And in her research, the degree to which Roosevelt was manipulating elections, manipulating the media, carrying out hate campaigns against his opponents, all of this was going on. So it was a denial of civil liberties, a manipulation of the press, fake news. All of these were the means of Franklin Roosevelt to overturn what America had been for a good part of its history into something that was a distorted and perverse version of an institutional change that made us, in many walks of life, the opposite of what was in the minds of the founding fathers.
All right. Well, you've raised a lot of great points. With respect to the misery that the or the stock market crash in 29 that you talked about, the Hooverville and so forth, there was also the suicides, Richard. The people that were multimillionaires that lost everything in that stock market crash. So they were jumping off, high-story buildings in New York City and elsewhere. And they really had to blame this on the failure of free enterprise. They really had no choice. If they had said, we're sorry, with the Federal Reserve that we put into existence in 1913 brought this about, there could have been a revolution, Richard. I mean, the anger would have been palpable if people had figured out that this was a government-caused stock market crash. And so the official story became, well, America's free enterprise system, it's a great system, but it has its flaws, and it caused all this misery. And it's a myth that has continued ever since. But you can understand their reasoning is that this is the way they deflect attention. It's also my recollection that in that 4-month period, you mentioned that Roosevelt is sworn in March, the election's in November. It's about 4 months that Hoover was trying to coordinate with Roosevelt during this transition period, trying to get things resolved, trying to reach some agreement, work together to resolve the crisis. It's my recollection that Roosevelt absolutely ignored him and just let the crisis get worse and worse and worse, so that when he took over, he could exercise these dictatorial powers. There's also, when Roosevelt takes over, he really did transform American life. As you pointed out, the National Recovery Act was very similar to what Mussolini was doing in fascist Italy. And I've mentioned this book before, but it's worth mentioning again, and that's Three New Deals by Wolfgang Schimmelbusch. I would highly recommend people read this book because it compares Hitler's economic policies, Mussolini's economic policies, and Roosevelt's economic policies, and shows that they were all variations on the same theme, that effectively you had 3 New Deals taking place in these 3 countries. In fact, Hitler actually sent a letter. This is in the 1930s. And Hitler sends a letter to Roosevelt commending him on his economic policies. He says, hey, we're doing the same thing over here. You are putting the national interest, the interest of the whole, the vote, society, the nation above the private individual interests of individuals. And so fascinating revelation there that Hitler's commending him on his economic policies. I think it's also worth mentioning, in addition to the National Recovery Act, which was, by the way, declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and rightly so, that Roosevelt ushers in Social Security, which is a straight socialist program, takes money from one person and gives to another person. I can guarantee you the first recipient of Social Security, I think her name was Ida Mae Fuller, did not put any money in, as is often said about Social Security. She just started receiving checks that were plundered and looted from those that were still producing. And that's the way it's been ever since. It's a straight transfer program. And notice that Roosevelt uses the emergency of this crisis to permanently permanently change America's economic system to a welfare state. And this was not a temporary measure. He also nationalized gold, which was, I think, one of the most incredible, abhorrent acts in American history. I mean, gold and silver coins had been the official money of the American people for more than 100 years. I mean, that's what the Constitution called for. No state, the Constitution expressly says, no state shall make anything but gold coins and silver coins legal tender. And it had been a major factor in the tremendous prosperity that I referred to in the late 1800s. Without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment, Roosevelt nationalizes gold. Everybody is now, by executive order that later got ratified by the Congress, turn in your gold. This is what requires a constitutional amendment. He's altering the system that's been established by the Constitution, but he does it by executive decree, same type of thing that Mussolini was doing and other dictators around the world, and makes it a felony offense to own gold. They actually prosecuted people for owning what had been the official money. There was a lawyer in New York City that said, this is my gold. And they got an indictment in this against this guy, prosecuted him for a felony offense. And then that's where we get the paper money system. That is, the paper money system's been giving us a debauched currency ever since, decade after decade after decade, to finance what became an ever burgeoning welfare state because of this transformation, this watershed period of the New Deal, and then the warfare state, the national security state that comes into existence after World War II. So it's been an absolute disaster. Richard, we got $34 trillion in debt, $80 trillion in unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare. We've got the Federal Reserve debauching currency and giving us all these booms and busts, and a diminution in the standard of living of what it otherwise would have been had you not had this massive confiscation of capital and savings and income over the decades. The question is, where do we go from here? I mean, we've had two separate systems, two completely opposite systems in American history. And I think it's pretty obvious which one is the better system.
Well, I think that we should keep in mind that these things don't happen overnight. And by the way, in spite of what often is portrayed in the history books, well, except for a few vested interests and old greedy capitalists, no one opposed the New Deal. That's nonsense. The fact is, there were many who wrote books, published articles attacking and criticizing the New Deal. I think most people know that one of the lead news magazines in America for the last 90 years has been U.S. News World Report. It was founded by a journalist named David Lawrence, who was reporting out of D.C. And he was publishing books in the 1930s criticizing Roosevelt. One was called, in 1934, called Stumbling into Socialism, how these policies were being implemented cumulatively, we're stumbling into socialism, that is government control. And then after the Supreme Court decisions of 1935 and 1936, overturning, as you were saying, the core programs of the New Deal, basically government central planning in the economy, uh, Roosevelt was furious. Roosevelt was furious. How dare those 9 men prevent progress in America, to keep us in the horse and buggy era? They were 9 old men, he said. Well, David Lawrence wrote a book responding to that called 9 Wise Men. That these 9 wise men were saying, let us not allow the emotions and the passions of the moment lead us to policies that undermine the founding of the country. And he defended their unanimous decision, their unanimous decision to basically declare unconstitutional all of these core New Deal programs. So as a consequence, America was saved from having a perhaps permanent centrally planned economy by these 9 justices on the Supreme Court. So people like David Lawrence and many others were opposing these things. But they were implemented, but they don't change the character of the country. And they don't really have their full effects for a while. It's sort of like someone who gets on drugs or drinks alcohol to excess. You can be told that if this keeps up, you're going to have cirrhosis of the liver, you could have brain damage, but you keep doing it, and the effects only finally emerge when it's finally been eating away at your system for years, decades. And now this is what America is suffering from. Those programs that began in these ways in the 1930s are now catching up with us, as you were saying, $34 trillion in debt, $2 trillion annual deficit budgets that the Congressional Budget Office says are going to continue for as far as the eye can see. Uh, Heavy-handed regulation, inflationary effects, a breaking down of the morality and respect for the individual and the free enterprise system, uh, basically the destruction of the federalist system upon a division of powers, both in the federal government as well as among the states. All of this now is catching up with us. The question is, how far do we want to allow it to go? To the end of total destruction of the American system, or to stop this in its tracks as best we can, and to halt the rot, and then try to find ways to move back towards a system of freedom, individual liberty, limited government, rule of law, constitutional division of powers, respect for private enterprise, enforcement of contract and property rights, and most importantly, the dignity of the individual who is allowed to manage and control his own life, guided by his own dreams, visions, meanings, and purposes, as opposed to the government attempting to treat him as a puppet at the end of the governmental strings.
Yeah, well, I know we're almost out of time or about out of time, but I wanted to amplify what you said about the 9 old men, because there was Roosevelt's infamous court packing scheme, where he proposed packing the Supreme Court with new justices to add on to any justice that was over 70 years of age, I think. And the whole idea was to pack the court with his cronies so that then he could get his socialist and fascist programs through the court. And it went down to resounding defeat in Congress. The people were outraged. It was just a total power grab straight out of fascist Italy. But in the long run, he ends up winning as justices start retiring or dying, and he gets to replace them. The other thing I wanted to mention is the issue of immigration. We shouldn't forget that Hitler was willing to let Jews leave Germany in the 1930s. This was long before the Holocaust, which was during the midst of the war, World War II. And the Roosevelt administration's policy was, oh no, we have immigration controls. We have the quota system, and we've already filled our quota for Germany. And so we're not going to allow any of these Jews that you're willing to let go. And so it's really the dark side of U.S. history, the U.S. participation in the Holocaust indirectly. And then he was forcing out all these Mexican citizens that had lived here for generations. I mean, there was an open border between Mexico and the United States ever since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I mean, it's not surprising. The U.S. had stolen the entire northern half of the country. And so people could come back and forth, and it was just normal. Mexican would come over here. He didn't become an American citizen. He just would live here and work and maybe go back. And Roosevelt during the Great Depression said, these people are taking jobs away from Americans. And so he forcibly uh, pushes them back to Mexico. I mean, there was so much, you know, uh, just anxiety, depression, these caravans of jalopies leading, going out of America and heading to Mexico. And then there was the children aspect, because a lot of the children were American citizens. They had been born here and they didn't know what to do with them. A lot of them left them here in the United States. Others took them back to Mexico. But it was just total anxiety that Roosevelt foisted on these people. Just one of the horror stories of the Great Depression.
Yeah, there are watersheds in history, as it's sometimes referred to. And one of the watersheds in American history was the dramatic transformation institutionally, politically, economically, at the end of the day, psychologically, in the fate of the United States that occurred because of a president who came to power in the midst of the Great Depression.
All right. On that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.